This is the Building Automation Monthly Podcast with Phil Zito, episode 128. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to the Building Automation Monthly Podcast. And in this episode, we are going to be continuing our four-part series on optimizing the use of your building automation system as a owner/operator. So in the past two episodes, episode 126 and 127, we discussed analyzing the existing use. Basically, how are you using your building automation system? And then we talked about getting back to the basics, how to set up the foundations for having a building automation system that you can optimally use. In this episode, we're going to be focusing in on setting up your process. And you may be wondering, what process? Well, in the previous episode, episode 127, we talked about how in this episode, and I know I'm saying episode quite a bit, but we talked about how we were going to discuss the triage process. And how did we come up with the triage process? What is it? And why is it so important for us to discuss? Well, in order for this episode to be really effective, we reached out to a lot of different facility leaders. We talked to folks who are running facility teams at hospitals, within commercial office space, at K through 12, at higher education, and we got a lot of interesting responses. We started to ask them what are your biggest barriers to utilizing your building automation system? And when it all panned out, we ended up with two common responses. First off, they didn't know what a BAS was capable of. And this is completely understandable. You know, we've seen this time and time again with my own experience starting off as a technician, running an ops team and running an integration arm of Johnson Controls, where I was responsible for the technical integration, so API design, systems integration, things like that. And time again, working with customers, we would see where they just didn't know what they didn't know. They didn't know what the BAS was capable of. And so that's why we covered that so heavily in episode 127. So if this is your first time listening to the Building Automation Monthly Podcast, first off, welcome. Thanks for being here. The second thing I would say is to go and listen to episode 126 and 127, because they will really provide some valuable context that addresses that first issue. But the second issue, and it was interesting that they went here and consistently went to this problem, and it was that these facility leaders didn't know how to fit a BAS into their processes. Now, partially this stemmed from not knowing what you can really do with a BAS, because at the end of the day, you get your 40 hours of training after a construction project, but then you may not do another construction project for decades. And that's really the limitation of controls training when it comes to owners, except for maybe focused training on a specific product. But at its core, the core BAS training, there's not a lot happening there. And so it's understandable why folks would wonder, how does it fit into their process? But also, as I look around and talked with various leaders and asked them, where did you learn about your processes? Where did you go to get trained on how, to triage issues and to be able to address issues as they come into your facility organization, issues being complaints, issues being system failures, etc. How did you come about being able to address this? And a lot of it was just tribal knowledge. Someone that they were under at a previous site passed it on to them, and so they've implemented it. And the problem with that was, and they openly admitted this, is that a lot of these processes that were developed back in the days when you had pneumatics, when your idea of triage was either waiting for a customer to complain or catching something when you're checking the gauges and the different sensors that you manually had to go into the field and check. This idea of having an automation system that processes all this data and provides it to you in user interface is still foreign to a lot of facility teams. And I know for some of you who are more advanced in your BAS journey, that may seem hard to believe, but there are quite a few organizations out there that are large organizations that still manage with clipboards. They have folks walking around and physically measuring systems, even though they have a building automation system. So from there, we moved into talking about what the current maintenance processes were with these facility organizations. And it kind of bucketed out into 3 buckets. The first was that they had a centralized dispatch with teams of folks with different skills. And basically, that meant that they had someone who was in some way processing data, and we'll talk about data intake in just a little bit, but in some way processing information coming in to that organization, whether it's complaints or emails or whatever. They would process that data and then hand it off to a team, a multidiscipline team, and that's how it was structured. They had a triage person, and then they had multiple discipline teams where the team consisted of a team lead who may just have some generic skills, and then a controls guy, a mechanic, and an electrician, and maybe even a plumber, all under that individual team. And it was basically like a little strike team, right? The second way that folks had things organized was a centralized dispatch once again, but the teams were kind of siloed into their functional areas. So you had a controls team, you had a mechanical team, you had an electrical team, and a plumbing team. And one of the consistent things was that in this model where you had the single discipline teams, there wasn't really a controls team by and large with the folks we talked with. There was mechanics, there were electricians, there were plumbers, and then there was someone who kind of knew a little bit about controls, and that person just kind of floated. So that was a real interesting observation. And the third structure was that there was no dispatch process, and it was just whatever complaint came in, someone handled it, and it got done. And this was either through the use of outsourced services or just having a jack-of-all-trades expert. We tended to see this in the smaller organizations, 1 to 2 schools, single office building, smaller, maybe 100-bed hospitals, was this kind of structure. And then as you move to the larger size of organization, it seemed to get more structured, although it wasn't always the case. Now, why do I tell you all this? What does this have to do with building automation? And why does any of this matter? Well, when we wrapped up the call with these facility leaders and we asked them, what do you most want to hear about this episode? Because it seems like you go to a customer's site and by and large, they don't know how to utilize the BAS and they're not seeing the value in it. And there's all these operator overrides and unacknowledged alarms. So something's broken in the process. And when they answered us, they said, well, they want to learn how to tie their BAS into their current processes, understand what other organizations are doing with their processes, and then figure out how to use the BAS as part of their essentially triage process. So in this episode, we're going to discuss that, because if you get that right, it's going to free up so much time, it's going to make your facility operate better, and it's just all around going to do good things. So if you're listening to this and you're a tech or you're in sales or you're an engineer and maybe you're not an owner or operator, there's still a lot of valuable insight for you here. Because one, it'll help you think when you're training or selling a solution or engineering a solution for your customer, kind of put yourself in their shoes. And as you listen to this episode, think about how are they operating the system? How are they processing data being complaints, data being failures? And then how, as a sales or a technician or an engineer, can you create a solution that will better enable this owner and operator to utilize that solution as part of their process? I could say from personal experience, it's when I started to, as a service tech very early in my career, when I started to engage with a customer's process, that's when I became the service tech they wanted on every call. And I've seen salespeople, I've seen engineers, I've seen technicians, and as the more they engage with that process, become part of that process and optimizing that triage process, the more valuable they are to their owner customers. All right, I think we beat that horse to death. So, question for you. What is the main goal of a facility? The main goal of a facility is not to run the building automation system. I know we in the BAS field like to think that that may be the main goal at times, but the main goal if you're in healthcare is creating a healing environment. If you're in commercial real estate, it's making sure that the experience for the tenant is optimized while keeping the cost down. If you're in K through 12, it's about educating and making sure you've got a good learning environment. So if we know that those are the main goals of the facility, then it's pretty easy for us to identify issues that are going to impact that goal. It's pretty easy for us to do that. And in this episode, we're going to talk about reacting to those issues. We're going to talk through a process that allows us to react effectively. And then in the next episode, we're going to talk through a proactive response so that we're getting ahead of issues prior to them occurring. And we'll talk through the tools and techniques that you can do that. So in a reactive scenario, it's all about properly triaging and processing the act of data ingestion. Now, I know that's a mouthful. Basically, what we're saying is you need to know what's going on in order to address it. Now, there's a lot of different ways that you can collect information on what is happening within a building. And here's just an example talking with folks of how they are collecting data related to failures and complaints. So they've got a dedicated email address or simply getting an email, phone calls, in person, obvious signs of failure. You walk in, you see a actuator that is broken off the shaft or is hanging there or is not actuating. I mean, that's an obvious sign of failure. During maintenance checks, even some larger organizations, they have a work order portal where actually tenants or just building occupants can go in and submit complaints, can submit issues. Now, the first step within any process is identifying what sources you want to collect data from. Because if you collect data from everything, it's really hard to organize that data and manage a process. Because if you've got someone calling, and then you've got someone emailing, and someone's saying something to you in the hallway, and then you're catching something on a maintenance check, and all of these data sources, they may pinpoint the exact same issue, but I've seen multiple situations where you've got teams that aren't communicating, and they're both working on the same issue at different parts of the system because there's no centralized collection of that data. So that's the first step that you can do, is to centralize the collection of the data and determine which way you want to collect that data, and then train your building occupants to use that form. In an ideal world, you would have a web portal where everyone would submit issues. Realistically, it's usually a phone line or an email. But whatever you choose, once you've chosen that, train folks to use that, and then break the habit of going and using any other way, to the point where even your own operators are using the same system. So if you take an email for complaints, if an operator finds an issue on a maintenance task, they can email that to that email system. Now, once you've done this, now you need to shift on the quality of the data. That's where your focus needs to move to. And how do you get quality data? Because we've all been there, where you're sitting there, you get a complaint on a room, and you have maybe a inexperienced BAS or mechanic, and they're sitting there on a cooling only box trying to figure out why the box isn't heating. And it's like the box can't heat. Or they're sitting there troubleshooting a space, and they're like, it keeps getting hot in here. It's 55-degree discharge. Why is it hot? Only to realize later that if they looked at the mechanical plans, they would have seen that there was a radiator or some sort of heat source along the window line that was not being controlled by the control system that was causing the heat issue. So having quality information coming in as a complaint source or as an issue source is key to properly responding. So how do you do that? What information are you looking for? Well, in order to effectively respond, you need to keep things simple. That's why we're focused in on one form of data collection, and now we're going to focus in on 4 key areas that we want to know with any form of complaint or issue that we observe or that we get contacted about. First, we want to know what. I mean, this seems so obvious, but what is the issue? It's hot in here. Okay, that's fine. I don't feel comfortable. Something is wrong. It's making a noise. Those are three different issues that may be related, but one of them is a lot more clear and easier to troubleshoot than it's making a noise or I don't feel comfortable. Saying it's hot in here, that gives you somewhere to start. You can go and check the set point, check the zone temp. That gives you an area. It's uncomfortable is not clear. You want to get specific with the issue. From there, you want to focus in on the how. And this is really important because the how is often the most commonly missed quality of a complaint or of an issue. And how did you experience the issue? This huge question, because quite often folks will tell someone else to go report the issue, and this person reporting the issue didn't experience it. So their information, especially if they aren't trained in mechanical systems, is not going to be very accurate. Heck, I've seen where they give the wrong room number or the completely wrong complaint. So how did you experience it will determine if the person who's complaining and going and using the system actually experienced the issue. And if they didn't, who did experience the issue? That way we can contact them and know exactly what happened. From there, we move on to the where. Where did this occur? Once again, something that seems so obvious to ask, but yet the building's hot is a lot different than the east side of the building's hot or the west side of the building's hot. There may be an air handler that is dedicated to serving the east side of the building. And knowing that the east side of the building is hot will take you from troubleshooting the central plant to troubleshooting the east air handler, which will save you time and help you resolve the issue faster. And then from there, when? When did this issue start occurring? How often does it occur? Does it occur at any particular time? We're looking for patterns here. And we'll talk about in next episode the proactive tools we can utilize to detect these patterns before they occur. But in this episode, we're going to focus on kind of what we have when we're reacting. So the questions that you want to collect information on are what is the issue? How did you experience this issue? And if you didn't experience it, who did? Where does this issue occur? And then when did it start occurring? How often does it occur? Does it occur at any particular time? So now with these 4 sets of information, you can begin the triage process. Now, I'm making an assumption that by using this, you have some form of triage. You have a system in place, you've structured your team, and great. If not, then that is something you'll definitely want to work on. And that's something we'll cover in our upcoming operator course that we'll be releasing if not later this year in 2018, in early 2019. So with that being said, you've got 3 ways you can do this. You've got untrained operator who will file a request into the work order management system. You've got to have a work order management system. Logs, while great and awesome, paper logs are very hard to search. They're very hard to use a lot of the proactive tools that we'll discuss in the next episode. And they are very hard to mine for historical context, meaning that if you want to understand historically how a piece of equipment is performed, or you want to see trends in degradation, meaning the equipment is increasingly having issues, things like that, then you really want to have this logged electronically. So picking a work order management system is a really important thing to do. Now, with that being said, as I mentioned, you can have an untrained operator. I've seen this, and we'll talk through a couple scenarios at the end of this episode. We're going to go through 3 different real-world customers and how they implement the triage process. But right now, we're just going to talk kind of high level. So you've got an untrained operator, right? This person is going to file a request in the work order management system. That request is going to have to be evaluated by someone. and that person then determines the issue. We've recently put together a BAS for mechanics course, which helps mechanics to go to a site and follow a checklist to determine if the issue is indeed a mechanical issue or a controls issue, because we've heard from our customers time and time again how much it is costing them to have mechanics troubleshooting controls issues and vice versa. So that was a course we created to help mechanical firms be able to determine if it is indeed a controls issue. That way the solution, or the problem rather, can be escalated to the proper person. So with that being said, once the request has been evaluated, then it's handed off to the appropriate team. And we've talked through team structure a little bit earlier in this episode. Second way you can do it is you can have a trained operator. So that first is an untrained operator. The second one is a trained operator, and they're going to investigate some key items. They're going to use a checklist, and they're going to go through this checklist of common items to determine if they can figure out what the issue potentially can be. That way they can file it in the work order management system under the proper team. And then that team's going to engage, and they're going to engage the appropriate person or persons based on the issue. And then finally, the third that we've seen work out is having a trained technician who's going to investigate and then file it to the appropriate team if they can't resolve it themselves. So those are the three ways that we've seen triage work. Now, once you begin to do this, you're going to have to move through the troubleshooting process. And while the troubleshooting process itself is a whole nother series of episodes that we will have coming up later this year, I'm going to give you kind of the high level look at the troubleshooting process. And then you can continue to build this out as you do it in-house, or you can just listen to our upcoming episodes on the troubleshooting process, which, as I mentioned, the time of recording this, it's August of 2018, and it should be available, that series, later in 2018. So whenever you begin a troubleshooting process, and this is something we hammer very heavily in our online courses, where we teach BAS professionals essentially the skills that no one else is teaching, we really hammer systems thinking and core issue diagnosis. And what I mean by that is, what is the real issue? The quicker you get to the real issue, whenever you're troubleshooting any system, the faster you're going to resolve it, the less time you're going to spend. And as we all know, we have limitations around trained resources, and that is across the industry, both as contractors, engineers, and owner-operators. Just the skills are not being developed. Folks aren't aware, and quite honestly, in some cases, that our trade even exists, which is a huge shame because this is an awesome field to work in, but that's a whole nother topic in itself. However, with that being said, a lot of folks aren't being taught to really diagnose the core issues because they're not being taught systems thinking. So you really want to figure out what could be causing the issue. So understanding systems thinking, if you understand how VAV box control works, you supply air and then you exhaust the air, and it's got air changes, and you're basically changing the volume of the air, and that's how you're controlling the temperature and humidity as well as the potentially CO2 in the space. Then you can understand that if you've got a hot call on a cooling only box, that you should probably first look at the damper, make sure it's open and airflow supplying, and that it's accurate airflow. But if that is met, then your most likely next step is to actually go look at the air handler and check the discharge air. You don't want to spend a whole ton of time checking other things. So by following a systems thinking process, you're able to identify the real issue, what's causing that real issue, and also, most importantly, what systems we can eliminate as a cause. If you've got a cooling only box and a space is hot, there's no reason to go check if the hot water system's on, because it's a cooling only box. There's no heating in it. So that's another example of how thinking through this is going to be really key. And then once you've pinned down the potential issues, you can utilize your BAS to help you isolate what's going on. You can use things like trends. You can use things like graphics to go and help you determine what is causing the issue. Now, here's where we get into a little bit of debate. I don't want to say debate. Debate's probably too strong of a word. But there's kind of, if you ever go into the field, I don't know about you listening to this, but myself, I grew up in the field and had folks who are always like, man, you can't sit at your computer. You got to actually get out there and look at the stuff. And all of these new folks these days, they just want to sit at the computer and da-da-da-da-da. And I'm like thinking to myself, yeah, but you don't ever want to even go into the computer. So, I mean, don't throw stones if you're in a glass house. But, there's some truth to both sides, right? The computer and the BAS is a great tool, but it's only a tool. It's a tool in your tool belt, just like your multimeter, just like your amp probe, just like your flow meter, your magnehelix gauge, etc., etc. They're all tools. And the right tool used at the right time will help you determine an issue. Now, we also have to be real with one another. If you are running a commercial real estate business and you have 200 buildings and your business model is to log in remotely, check the issue, and then use a subcontractor to come on site and troubleshoot the issue, well, then you're obviously going to be heavily focused on utilizing the BAS. However, if you're someone who has people on site, you may go and do a combination of having them physically checking the equipment while being wirelessly connected to the BAS and checking the BAS front end. So you really got to understand not only how your organization is structured and culturally, how your folks tend to troubleshoot and use systems, but you also have to really encourage your team to use the right tool to identify the right issue. So it's not always the software, it's not always the equipment. You've got to be willing to embrace all the tools that are at your fingertips in order to properly troubleshoot a system. I feel like that is something that personally, just speaking for myself here, made me and my team of service techs that I led back early on in my career very effective at troubleshooting, is that we embraced both the software as well as the mechanical side. We'd have competitions to see who could go and mount controllers on a VAV box or a fan coil as fast as possible. And we would also have challenges of reverse engineering programs to see kind of how a program was working and explain it to our team. Now, granted, that's probably not something an owner-operator is going to want to do. It's not inherently tied back to their core mission, but for a contractor, it's a really good tool to really enhance the comfort level of working with controls. So once you've done that kind of utilizing your tools, you figure out the issue, you address the issue or escalate it to the proper person. You then put the resolution and notes associated to the resolution back in your work order management system. You see, we've got this cycle right now of data collection, addressing the issue, and then logging how we address the issue. That way, when someone comes back, for example, if you go to a unit and you're troubleshooting because the cooling coil is plugged, that's what you end up finding out. The cooling coil is plugged. Well, then you enter that in the work order management system. Same issue happens again, and it happens again and again, and it's starting to happen in increasing frequency. Well, then that can start to point you to potentially other issues. Maybe someone is not properly straining the system. Maybe the strainers are plugged. Maybe there's some sort of other issue that is causing debris to foul up this system. So that is where it becomes increasingly important for you to log issues. That way you have that historical context. Okay, so at this point, you've got a couple questions you need to ask yourself. And once we've gone through these, we're then going to go through some common examples, a couple customers that we've worked with and how they've organized their teams. But some questions you want to ask yourself in order to properly structure a facility team in order to triage building events and then utilize the BAS properly. First, you want to know, are you a local organization or a remote organization structure? Meaning, Do you have local presence, or do you mainly utilize a VPN, connect to your sites, remotely monitor them, and then dispatch? That's a huge difference in process. Are you outsourcing or insourcing your staff? Are you heavily reliant on subcontractors, which is not necessarily a bad thing depending on your business model? Or do you rely heavily on local talent or talent that you have within your organization? What skill sets do you want to invest in? Do you want to send your folks to the most advanced BAS training for that product? Do you want to have folks who are degree level engineers, meaning that they are not just engineers by title, but actually could qualify as a quote unquote technical, accredited, certified, licensed, wherever you're at in the world, engineer? Do you want that level of skill? Maybe you do. Maybe you don't. It just depends on what that level of skill will provide you based on the goals for your organization. And then what do you need to change in your BAS to achieve this? We talked about this in episode 127, and it's something that you really need to think about. Creating standards for your BAS, properly utilizing graphics, trends, alarm plays, arms, etc. So now, from all of this, let's take a look how this actually plays out in the real world. So the first example is from a healthcare organization that we worked with. And this healthcare organization, it had a volunteer. This was like a 65, 70-year-old guy. He would come in and he would actually answer the phones. And then he would go and write down on a piece of paper, on a logbook, the issues that he got. And periodically, every couple hours, someone from the maintenance team would check those issues and then would go and dispatch it. They had a mechanical team, an electrical team, and then they outsourced controls. At first, the mechanics would try to address the issue. If they couldn't through a form of override, then they would go and bring in the subcontracted controls group to go and address the issue. Some of the issues with this were, one, issues didn't always get handled as fast as they should. There were times when certain critical spaces were out of design parameters for a long period of time. Additionally, since this was someone who had no BAS training doing triage, the notes he would take on the phone weren't necessarily always reflective of the issues that were being experienced. And then sometimes the mechanics would get busy when they put stuff in hand and they wouldn't escalate it or log it because there was no log or feedback process. And so this resulted in a lot of operator overrides. So one of the first things we implemented when we worked with them was to go and set up a logging process, work order management process, and to make sure that we were running regular operator override reports to see if there were any issues. Next up was a university where they had a dedicated dispatch, and they would utilize engineers from their engineering department as kind of a work study. And what would happen is those folks would then hand off to a dedicated controls team. The controls team would investigate and would escalate to the mechanic or the electrician if it wasn't controls. This worked really well. The only area that really needed to be enhanced was proper trending and alarming on the systems. Because there weren't proper alarms and trends, there was very often a reactive mode and not a proactive mode, and we'll talk through that in the next episode, how to get more proactive. And finally, commercial real estate. So this had a custom portal for customers to essentially go and respond to. They would enter their complaints, and then as they entered their complaints, it would get reviewed by a central operator, and that operator would then escalate the issue after they remotely reviewed it, and they would escalate it to an on-call subcontractor. The key point here was implementing a work order management system and properly tracking contractor resolution, because there was a gap between contractor resolution and that feedback loop to the actual customer / tenant. So that was an important area to close that gap. So you're seeing these things outside of having an organization that has absolutely no skills, no training, nothing. most of the time it's minor tweaks to make the facility group utilize the BAS and to operate more efficiently. So, with that being said, this is a process. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So don't feel overwhelmed by everything I've told you here. If you're an owner or operator, or even if you're on the contractor or engineer side, don't feel like you have to accomplish all of this at once. Just make steps. A little bit of progress every day will result in major gains down the road. Now, as I mentioned, we've got an upcoming operator course that is going to focus in on these processes. It's going to have checklists and documentation and training on how to achieve this. And that will roll out on the podcast. We'll tell you when that course is available. Probably be late 2018, if not early 2019. Just depends on how some things flush out. Now, in the next episode, we're going to be discussing how to optimize this process using proactive tools. So everything we discussed at this episode, you will be able to find at buildingautomationmonthly.com/128. Once again, that is buildingautomationmonthly.com/128. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. It was great to have you here once again. Look forward to closing out this series with you next week, where we talk through how to proactively utilize everything we've covered. And I think you're going to have a lot of positive outcomes from that. If you've got any questions, feel free to hit us up via our live chat button. I think it says leave us a voicemail if I remember correctly. It's at the bottom right-hand side if you're on a laptop of our website, buildingautomationmonthly.com. And if you're looking to grow in your building automation knowledge, if you are running an organization and it's just really difficult to get folks up to speed, and you know that you could be doing so much more if you could just get the core training that your technical team needs in order to operate a facility or in order to install controls or service controls, then reach out to us at sales@buildingautomationmonthly.com. We have a new corporate training program that is working excellently for our corporate clients, where we are helping them to close the core skill set gaps that aren't being addressed through manufacturer training and just aren't being addressed in the industry. Things like understanding HVAC control sequences, understanding the fundamentals of BAS, being able to appropriately install, start up, and check out a building automation system, being able to program building automation systems, and understanding information technology. So if you have backlog that you're not able to execute because you don't have the talent, or you simply would like to increase the profitability of your building automation business, then reach out to us, as I mentioned, at sales@buildingautomationmonthly.com, and we would love to tell you more about our corporate training program and how it may be a fit for your organization. Thanks a ton for being here. Can't wait to talk to you again in the next episode. Take care.